Hello, my name is Jeremy. I'm the host of Examining Life. This is episode 3 of Arthur Schopenhauer, the first European Buddhist. The focus of this episode is going to be the transcendent will. The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer is known as two things. First, he is considered the father of pessimistic philosophy. Second, he was the first ever European Buddhist. Over the course of this series, our goal is to make these two lofty titles make sense. To do so, we're breaking Schopenhauer's philosophy down into parts, episode by episode. Each episode answers a key part of the puzzle in his philosophy, including but not limited to why you're so anxious and depressed, seriously, why no amount of pleasure is sufficient for fulfillment, why individuality is an illusion, the basis of morality, and perhaps most importantly, the way to face life in the midst of rampant, inevitable suffering. Last episode, we explained Schopenhauer's metaphysics, namely why he thinks the world is composed of two ontological categories, will and representation. We explained that in our efforts to understand the external world, we run into an issue, namely that our understanding of the external world is mediated by representations. The question that Schopenhauer was trying to answer in the last episode was this: how can we get knowledge that is not representational? Schopenhauer's answer to this question was that we have direct, unmediated access to our inner nature through introspection, in which we can become aware of what he calls our will. Given that this will is the sole thing that is not representation, he concludes that the will is what lies behind all representations. This is to say that beneath all of our experiences, beneath all phenomena, there is merely will. Thus, the will, according to Schopenhauer, is a unity that transcends our own apparent individuality. In this episode, we will flesh out what this will is, expecting the next 15 or so minutes to learn the answers to questions such as, what does it mean to say the world is will? Is the self an illusion? How does art and music teach us the inner nature of the world? Where do our desires and actions come from? And much, much more. Now, before we get into the content for today's episode, I want to explain the method I'm going to use and hopefully to justify Schopenhauer's conception of the will. As I read him, there are two general methods that Schopenhauer uses to expound upon the will. The first is through introspection. The rationale here is that we discovered the will through introspection, so it would be intelligent to uncover as much as possible through this method. The second method begins with broad observation of the world, notably the pervasive suffering that Schopenhauer sees all around him. From these observations, Schopenhauer proposes to induce what is likely to lie behind the phenomenal world. In other words, he is answering the following question: given how suffering-ridden the world is, what is likely to be the underlying ground of our existence? If these two methods, introspection and induction, converge on what they reveal about the will, that, for Schopenhauer, is good reason to accept his theory. In this episode, we will examine Schopenhauer's first method of understanding the will: introspection. Before we get to that, however, if you enjoy videos like this that make philosophy accessible without dumbing it down, I'd really appreciate it if you take a few seconds of your day to like this video and subscribe to my channel. It really helps small YouTubers like me who are just starting out. Thank you, and let's get back to the video. Last episode, we understood that the will is an undifferentiated unity. There's only one will. Despite initially recognizing the will in oneself alone, we have various ways of realizing that the will is a self-transcending unity. According to Schopenhauer, the most compelling way to come to this realization is through meditative states of absorption, similar to those described in Buddhism. Both the Buddha and Schopenhauer describe the phenomena of being utterly absorbed within experience, such that the distinction between the subject and the object of the experience falls away. As the Buddha is quoted in the Bahia Sutta, quote, "You should train yourself thus. In reference to the seen, there will be only the seen. In reference to the heard, only the heard. In reference to the sensed, only the sensed. When for you there will be only the seen in reference to the seen, only the heard in reference to the heard, only the sensed in reference to the sensed, then there's no you in connection with that. When there's no you in connection with that, there is no you there." Schopenhauer describes the same phenomena, only in slightly different terms. He says, quote, "Thus we no longer consider the where, the when, the why, and the whither in things, but simply and solely the what. We devote the whole power of our mind to perception, sink ourselves completely therein, and let our whole consciousness be filled by the calm contemplation of the natural object actually present. We lose ourselves entirely in this object. In other words, we forget our individuality, our will, and continue to exist as clear mirror of the object, so that it is as though the object alone existed without anyone to perceive it, and thus we are no longer able to separate the perceiver from the perception, but the two have become one, since the entire consciousness is filled and occupied by a single image of perception. The key similarity between these passages from the Buddha and Schopenhauer respectively is the emphasis on the collapse of the subject-object distinction. Both mystics, through meditative absorption and present perception, teach that the separation we typically assume exists between ourselves and the world is an illusion. Now, you may be thinking to yourself something like this. Well, okay, Buddha, okay, Schopenhauer, this is great and all, but I haven't had the time to sit on top of the Himalayas and meditate until I became enlightened. For a normal person like me, someone who's never meditated, or if they have, hasn't had the insight required to dissolve their ego, how can I realize the truth of what you're saying? At this point, Schopenhauer would point you to an experience that you most likely are familiar with. You know that feeling when you're watching an amazing movie, looking at a beautiful piece of art, watching a gorgeous sunset, or just listening to your favorite song, and you just sort of melt into the experience. For me, this has happened when blasting music while driving down the highway. It's happened watching sunsets. It's happened observing experts work at their craft. Schopenhauer would point you towards these moments. In that split second when you're most absorbed, something happens. You forget about yourself. You forget about your fight with your partner. You forget about the dishes in the sink. You forget about the assignment due tomorrow. You forget about that back pain that was just bothering you. And in the midst of all of this forgetting, Schopenhauer is also claiming that we can realize something new. In these moments, the distinction between ourselves and the world slips away. Schopenhauer is telling us that if we pay close enough attention, we will realize that our separateness from the world, what Schopenhauer calls the principle of individuality, is an illusion. Our sense of self dissolves to the realization that we are merely a tiny part of a transcendent unity, a unity which encompasses the whole world. For present purposes, the key conclusion is the realization that whatever our inner nature is, the will, must also be the inner nature of the external world as a whole. If this doesn't do it for you, if it seems maybe a little bit wishy-washy, Schopenhauer provides another argument that the will is a unity, having to do with ideas of space and time. I'm going to go over this briefly because it could be a whole episode into itself, and truthfully, it's not that important for understanding Schopenhauer as a whole. But if you need hard reasons to accept the unity of the will, the idea is this. Space and time are fundamental to separateness. Without space and or time to separate two distinct appearances, the two appearances would be one. However, going back to Kant, space and time exist solely in the phenomenal world, the world of representations. This is to say that space and time don't exist in the thing in itself. They don't exist in the will. It follows from this that the will must be a unity because there is no space or time to serve as the basis of separation. Again, if you don't need hard reasons and this doesn't make sense, don't worry. I'll just ask that you grant that the will is, in fact, a unity. Now that we understand the transcendent unity of the will, it would make sense to introspect upon the will as it appears within ourselves, to discover everything that we can about it. Then, we will be able to extrapolate outwards from our own inner nature to the inner nature of the world as a whole. The signature description that Schopenhauer gives to the will here is that the will is a restless striving based in our physiology. He notices that our bodies strive for various aims without conscious deliberation, and he observes that at the most basic level, this bodily striving aims towards personal preservation and development. Our stomachs demand that we eat and coordinate with our hands and mouths to do so. Our legs, in coordination with the rest of our body, set out into a run when posed with a threat, and so on. He says, quote, "The parts of the body must correspond completely to the chief demands and desires by which the will manifests itself. They must be the visible expression of these desires. Teeth, gullet, and intestinal canal are objectified hunger. The genitals are objectified sexual impulse. Grasping hands and nimble feet correspond more indirectly to the strivings of the will which they represent." While we need not read Schopenhauer as literally mapping drives onto different parts of the body, his point is rather straightforward. The will within us is purely physiological. It is an embodied bottom-up force that pulls our behavior in one way or another according to unconscious drives and desires. Our bodies, through which the will manifests, compulsively, restlessly strives for its development and preservation. Beneath our actions, what's really going on is a bunch of embodied drives pulling our behavior in various ways. You can think of the will as impulses in your body that manifest through your actions. If you recognize other thinkers like Nietzsche or Freud in this description of human behavior, that would be apt, as Schopenhauer is considered the father and grandfather of each thinker, respectively. Now, at one level, our unrelenting drives, this striving within us, may be thought of as purposeful, namely for the purpose of self-preservation. This is one respect out of many in which Schopenhauer was well ahead of his time, as his theory can easily be translated into Darwinian terms which wouldn't be coined for another half-century or so. In Darwinian terms, we may think of Schopenhauer's will as something like our genes or DNA. Our genes' only interest is in making us survive long enough in order to attract, mate, and reproduce. Any behaviors, practices, and drives that are likely to bring about offspring are selected for by natural selection, irrespective of all other outcomes. No matter how much we care about other outcomes, such as suffering, well-being, beauty, or morality, our genes don't. Our genes merely use experiences such as suffering as a means to proliferate themselves. In other words, according to Darwinism, everything we do is subservient to survival and reproduction. This means that, to the extent that we care about things other than survival and reproduction, the genes that determine us are blind to our interests. Likewise, even though at one level our will may be considered purposeful in that it strives for personal preservation, at a higher level, such as an ultimate telos or purpose, the will is blind. The will behind our experience doesn't care about moral perfection, truth of the cosmos, or human flourishing. It doesn't care about who's suffering or how much. It doesn't care to be even or fair. It just is, and it undergoes transformation without any justification. In virtue of the will's purposelessness, meaninglessness, and inexplicability, Schopenhauer describes the will as blind striving, without knowledge and without satisfaction. The will is groundless and reasonless. It is only at the level of representation that we try to use reasons, make connections, and explain phenomena as it's represented to us. However, beneath our representations, beneath our names and labels, there's just inexplicable, unfolding, striving will. This means that the world as a whole is unjustifiable, a claim that you'll see will become important later. Now, as we talked about earlier, Schopenhauer has insisted that this will, despite appearing to us as fragmented through representations, is nonetheless a single transcendent unity. As such, Schopenhauer suggests that we can infer that the same process of blind striving happens in everything else, albeit in more rudimentary forms. The will, according to Schopenhauer, can be observed in all forms of life, such as plants and animals, all of whom strive for personal preservation and development. They seek resources from their environment, they develop themselves, they fend off threats, and so on. Schopenhauer suggests that this will is in all inanimate objects as well, just in rudimentary forms that are difficult to identify. For Schopenhauer, our universal will doesn't imply that everything is necessarily conscious with deliberate aims at self-preservation. He would view this conclusion as overly anthropomorphizing the will. The idea does not require consciousness or deliberate intention, merely transformative behavior that serves that object's preservation. Truthfully, Schopenhauer isn't super explicit about what this means, and I would guess that that's because he's being modest and that he isn't sure. But as I understand him, the best way to understand this concept is by first understanding that the will has its furthest development in humans, while it has only a minimal development in inanimate objects. A mountain, for example, undergoes slow changes according to movements in tectonic plates, which Schopenhauer may view as their manifestation of will. To summarize this episode's content briefly, we've examined similarities between Schopenhauer and Buddhism, with the aim of revealing that the will is a single unity of which any apparent individual is a small part. It may be said that everything is merely a manifestation of will in a similar respect to how a single blade of grass is a manifestation of a field, or a branch a manifestation of the tree. We then went on to examine our inner nature and understood it as a blind, restless, physiological striving. This restless striving makes itself known through introspection as action. Then, from the understanding that our own inner nature is the same as the inner nature of the world, we've extrapolated that in each of the will's manifestations, that is, in each apparent object, the will manifests as a blind, embodied striving. Now, if you remember from the beginning of the episode, I claimed that Schopenhauer has two ways of revealing the will. The first was introspection, which was the focus of this episode. The second is inference, namely, inferring what is likely to underlie our existence given the ubiquity of suffering. Now, some of Schopenhauer's greatest, most relevant, and most famous insights come from his expositions on suffering and suffering's connection to the will. His conclusions are tragic, they're poetic, they're explanatory, and overall, they're just way ahead of his time. He provides a basis for what we know today as the hedonic treadmill. He explains why no amount of pleasure is ever enough, why selfishness will always fail, why we get anxious over productivity and accomplishments. I could go on. The point is, he had insights into human nature that we need to hear today. Insights which run against the grain of typical Enlightenment thinking, namely that we're moving towards perfection. There's a lot that this man Schopenhauer has left to teach us, so make sure to stay tuned for part 4 of the series, where I'll explain Schopenhauer's famous pessimistic philosophy, including his claims on the ubiquity of suffering. Thank you for tuning in, and if you haven't already, please like and subscribe, and I hope to see you soon.